His writings have included critiques of government hate speech legislation, the housing crisis, and its impact on young people. And I know he's chaired a couple of conferences in that. Recently, participated in one in Danube Institute in Hungary, and the role of the Catholic Church in society, which of course a key theme for Desmond Fennell at times. Theo is a prolific speaker and writer, and he brings a younger voice to today's discussions. And we are delighted to have him with us here this morning. Over to you.
It's great to be introduced as a younger speaker. I looked at my grey hairs this morning, so it's good to be introduced.
Enjoy it while it lasts.
Enjoy it while it lasts, right. Well, thank you to the organisers for inviting me here today to speak about Desmond Fennell. I'm just going to touch on some current themes and how it relates to some of the writings that Fennell, wrote back in the day. Because Desmond Fennell did have a lot to say about the social and moral dilemmas of his day that I feel informs the present and kind of helps us to navigate this perilous world we live in today. Whether it was the creeping influence of Anglo-American cultural trends that I really feel upended what distinguished Ireland and the British Isles, kind of subsuming us into provinciality status, or warning what was to come in the epoch of the post-Christian age heralded by the dropping of the atomic bomb. I feel Fennell's literature offers contemporary observers of the current social ills a guide to seek answers and explanations. As a young person lost in an age of post-nation nihilism, where spiritualism has been replaced by materialism, where globalism has displaced nationalism, and where pluralism has been upended by a de-foreign-imposed orthodoxy, I feel Fennell's prose offers a brief respite from modernity. When I first discovered Desmond Fennell, he was music to my ears. I had often pondered and even written about the lack of distinctiveness which had subsumed Ireland in the West's liberalised age. Having for the most part lost our native tongue, all we had left was our characteristic faith, or what Desmond Fennell described as the image of the good Catholic, as that was interpreted in Ireland. He continued by saying, now we have nothing, or rather nothing of our own. I remember thinking this, and asking, where has this been all my life? This man was articulating a view of Ireland that had been internally nagging me for years. Walking down the streets of Dublin these days, you often struggle to differentiate between it and, let's say, Manchester or Birmingham, bar maybe the distinctive Georgian architecture, the lack of modern architecture, or a dearth in high-rise. Our capital city is increasingly assimilating into the monotonous age of aesthetic uniformity. But what better encapsulates this monotony than the spire, an edifice of sheer nothingness, an eyesore which reminds Dubliners and tourists alike of the lack of architectural identity in our main thoroughfare. For unique insights into the spire, the tourist blog site TripAdvisor offers some blunt observations. A tourist from Belfast remarked that it's a metal tower, end of, nothing much to see here, move along. A Belgian visitor questioned what it symbolises, if anything. They said, it is big, sure, that's impressive at first, but after a while, it starts to bore you as well. For what does it mean? Someone from London quipped, the trouble with many town planners is they lack imagination. Erecting this lump of metal is a perfect example. What is it supposed to represent? Who cares? They should take it down and start again. But for Fennell, while not a TripAdvisor aficionado, but rather a critic of the post-Western civilizational age, the spire represented the Irish Republic's submission to the forces of architectural oikophobic revisionism. He mentioned that it would have suited the English seaside port of Blackpool rather than Ireland's capital city. However, on reflection, he recognised that it was at least an honest statement of the Republic's state of mind after its prudent self-effacement during the Northern War and during the past-effacing enrichment of the Celtic Tiger boom. He said it stood for, represented, and said nothing. Having been replaced by Nelson's pillar dedicated to the victor of Trafalgar, Horatio Nelson, that monument had always served as a representation of Ireland's minority but elite Protestant ascendancy, gleeful that the Lord had defeated the French and Spanish allies of Catholic Ireland. Following independence, debate raged over what would replace the monument. Those of a more conservative disposition wished for the structure to be maintained, including the poet William Butler Yeats, who stated that the life and work of the people who built it are part of our tradition. Now, some argued it should be replaced with a statue honouring the legacy of our patriot dead, including Porrick Pierce, Arthur Griffith, or as an olive branch to Northern Protestants, Robert Emmet. All these suggestions were rejected by the Dublin Corporation, with attempts to raise funds for a Pierce statue from Irish Americans rejected by Taoiseach Sean Lemass. Now, some of the more militarist elements wished to see it destroyed, and destroy they did. On March 8, 1966, the pillar was exploded by a bomb placed by a group of dissident Irish volunteers. The adage that revolutionaries are great at destroying rather than building springs to mind when examining the failure of the Irish state to replace Nelson's pillar with a similar symbol of national pride. When the Celtic Tiger came around in honour of the millennium at a cost of $4 million, the spire as we know it today was complete. A representation of our newfound wealth, you could say, towering, shiny and upright, but as Fennell said, self-effacing. These postmodern spaces are designed to deracinate us, to kill our spirit, to take away what we once had, to usher in an era of nothingness, as Fennell proclaimed. Now recently, the former Monaghan senior GAA manager, Seamus Banty McInerney, secured permission to convert the building where James Joyce's The Dead was set into apartments. The house, a representation and relic of an old Irish laureate, an expression of Dublin's artistic nature, is set to be replaced to make way for our new rentier economy. In 2023, over 90% of supply in Dublin was built to rent, with the city looking more and more bland as the days go by. Gone are the days when we built housing estates for families. Now we cater to a rentier class to satisfy the yields of avaricious international investment funds. This, I would argue, is a direct result of the increasingly centralising approach to governance within the Irish state. In 2017, with centralisation the norm in Irish governance, Fennell wrote in About Being Normal, My Life in Normal Circumstances, of the detachment centralised bureaucrats have from the masses. For them, quote, the nation was not a community of communities which the administrative apparatus existed to serve. But in Fennell's view, the nation was, by nature, a community of communities, leading, quote, unrecognised and unthwarted thwarted existences, but still existing by reason of the shared life of their members and their vague self-consciousness, in order to serve the needs of, quote, embryonic, frustrated communities so that they could begin to develop towards real communal being as self-governing collectivities, fashioning their own lives and worldviews. They needed territorial definition and representative institutions with executive and decision-making powers. They needed this representation of their reality to themselves. But right now, just 7% of public spending in Ireland is controlled by local bodies. Once the backbone of housing provision, among other things, local authorities have been neutered by successive governments, seemingly hell-bent on imposing ever more centralised bureaucratic layers on the masses, as though we are still serving detached colonial overlords. The housing estates of the past saw the construction of homes for families in mind, a far cry from today's housing supply, which sees us, as Fennell postulated, as mere, quote, individuals with various administrative aspects to be dealt with by the relevant central agencies. Now, leaving aside the provision of what constitutes housing, the failure of the state in providing strategic infrastructure is a direct result of this centralising attitude. The delayed Children's Hospital, in which costs have spiked to €2 billion, has seen politicians signing contracts with private contractors who fleece the taxpayer over budget and behind schedule. A far cry from the infrastructural behemoths of the past, including the hydroelectric power station Ardnacrusha in the 1920s, which provided for 80% of the nascent Irish Free State's energy needs. But instead of carrying the legacy of our forefathers, our leaders have decided to adopt foreign standards and governance not suited to Irish particularities. In the same book, he spoke of the failure by Irish leaders to not adopt nationalist governance, instead opting for the inherited British imperial centralising model, which, for Fennell, quote, was not designed to accommodate the Irish human reality, but rather to suit imperial administration. As Fennell outlined, quote, the old nationalism had simply ignored the matter, taking the British arrangements as a given, and even strengthened them by enshrining the British county system in the structure of the Gaelic Athletic Association. The foreignness of such centralisation proved itself in how detrimental this trend was for our native tongue. For Fennell, the Dublin liberal elite promoted centralism as a way of stifling cultural expression. Quote, since the foundation of the state, the Dublin establishment had been resolutely centralist and centralising, and consumerist liberalism now have this resolution extra force. Fennell observed that liberals regarded a pluralist Ireland, or an Ireland in which various communities shaped their lives as they saw fit, as an enigma. What we called well-taught self-government they smeared as apartheid, he remarked. His yearning for decentralisation informed his advocacy for a Gaelic revival. Having been stripped of our language through years of systemic political oppression and cultural suppression from the British administration, the independent Irish state made little to no effort to revive or promote our native tongue. In State of the Nation, Ireland since the 60s, written in 1983, Fennell described the gradual process which saw Irish no longer prioritised. Quote, in 1973, Gaelic ceased to be an obligatory subject for state examinations in schools, or a requirement for entry to the civil service. Now, known as a man of extremes, Fennell and his wife decided to migrate to the isolated Gaeltacht island off the coast of Connemara named Weenish. But notice that it too was similarly, if not more neglected than the rest of the country, where community life had disintegrated, households lived their own lives, and individualism was the dominant mode. That prioritization of individualism, Fennell discussed in reference to the centralization of government, seeped its way into the feeble and futile attempts to resuscitate the language of our ancestors. In the same book, he notes that a Dublin-centric administration defied the nature of language by deluding themselves into thinking that the Gaelic revival would be affected by individuals and individual effort, on the false assumption that the process itself would somehow take place throughout all of Irish society simultaneously, focusing on Dublin and, as highlighted, neglecting the Gaeltacht or Irish-speaking areas. The indifference that the education system, bar some exceptions, has to Irish today as a mere subject among many, that should be only taught as a means of passing exams and not a way of embracing and imbuing our distinctive dialect on the youth, has rendered this nation all but obsolete. As Porrick Pierce once said, a country without a language is a country without a soul, or Tirgan Tanga Tirgan Anam. Now, some may argue that Irish is unimportant. Don't you know that English is the language of global commerce? How is Ireland meant to prosper economically if we speak that backward, ancient language that those pagan Celts spoke? This utilitarian perspective is pervasive in Ireland today. But it is our lack of native tongue, I would argue, which has hastened our lack of national autonomy, and our dependence on what Fennell described as, quote, consumerist liberalism of the Anglo-American world image on discourse transmitted from the capitalist power centres of London, New York, and Washington. For Fennell, a distinctive language, or what he described as a, quote, language of our own, was essential for social cohesion. Quote, every nation that speaks a distinctive tongue has within that tongue, which is merely a verbal communication system, a particular way of seeing life and talking about it. Referencing France and Sweden, who, having maintained their languages, managed to harness social bonds via their shared communicative style, so that their national life has become both a mirror of all human life and their means of constructing their own particular image of it. This lack of familiarity with one another and an absence of a distinctive tongue has made Ireland even more susceptible to the cultural influences of Anglo-America. From sports to films, almost everything we consume is imported, to the point that most small talk these days consists solely of what we are watching on Netflix, or whether we saw the Liverpool match last night, or no, sorry, I was watching the NFL, I didn't have time. What Fennell described as an outward conformity and imitation. Fennell's desire to adopt the Israeli approach, a sort of Gaelic kibbutz, stemmed from his appreciation of Jewish success in reviving Hebrew. Founding the Israel in West Connaught, he encouraged the migration of people to the Gaeltacht to resurrect Irish, including his own Weenish, which he later changed to Mao-inish, meaning Mao Island, named after, yes, the revolutionary communist president of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong. Great guy. For some, he was in. Now, does this mean that Fennell, was using Irish as a sort of Trojan horse in order to usher in some Marxist utopia? I would argue no. For some, he was a raging nativist, hell-bent on maintaining or imposing a Catholic theocracy. For others, a neo-Marxist whose politics were that of a proletarian class struggle against bourgeois D4 elites. In truth, Fennell's thoughts went beyond the left-right divide, making him an original public figure. But while he admitted to being inspired by the other socialist tradition that turned away from the modern state and towards a multi-centered, communitarian society of shared ownership in which people could truly be masters of their lives and in which democracy would be what the word means and not a system of legitimizing the imperialism of power elites and national and world power centers, he lamented that the majority of socialists did not follow that socialism. He added that he would have liked to have seen that socialism tested for its capacity to produce the goods sufficiently, tested in a number of countries with different cultures, as the other kind had been tested and found wanting. From this, we can glean that Fennell was someone who assessed ideas not by their theoretical underpinnings, but rather from an empirical and practical perspective, basically what works. Such thinking is unheard of in our Anglo-American culture war age, where you are either left-wing or right-wing, or even worse, the centrist dad. I think this speaks to the very heart of Fennell's passion for pluralism, in contradiction to the boxing in of different groups, peoples, and ideas into specific narrow identities and persuasions. This passion for plurality and idiosyncrasy saw Fennell propose and come up with innovative and unique proposals for a united Ireland. Writing in his 1986 book, Nice People and Rednecks, Ireland in the 1980s, Fennell references international examples of where differing ethnicities and religious groups can coexist peacefully and harmoniously, referencing Switzerland, West Germany, and America, quote, which don't have only one legal system for the entire country, but which allow the various federal units, the various provinces, cantons, or states to make their own laws about most matters. He admired the Ottoman Empire's pluralism, which allowed the various Christian communities and the Jews not only to maintain their own schools, but to administer their own marriage laws and related matters. He added that he abhorred the imposition of unnecessary uniformity. For Fennell, quote, justice and peace among nations and within nations begins with the honest recognition of diversity. Having been born in Belfast to a Catholic family, but later moving to Dublin, he had first-hand experience of the discriminatory statehood that existed in the northeastern section of the island. While an ardent nationalist, Fennell had great sympathy for Unionists who felt cornered by the Republic and its irredentist claims and London. Their cultural links with Britain are more with Scotland than with England. They are keenly aware that most British people have little regard for them, he mentioned in Cutting to the Point, Essays and Objections in 2003. In keeping with his attachment to pluralism, despite his nationalist credentials, he admired Unionists who held on to their distinctive identity, even as those in the Republic, including of a nationalist dispensation up north, such as the SDLP, abandoned theirs. And when we look at Northern Ireland today, and the state of nationalist politics there and down south, how much has changed from how Fennell described things back in his day? When we see Northern Unionists who once again abandoned by Westminster as they impose a sea border between Northern Ireland and Britain in the name of getting Brexit done, yet still uphold their attachment to their British and Protestant identity. Yet at the same time, we observe so-called nationalist parties attack the very faith whose minority status in the past they were set up to defend as somehow backward, or even demanding an end to Catholic schools. Fennell foretold how what he termed the new Republican elite would reinterpret the republicanism of Eamon de Valera as, quote, the pursuit of an all-Ireland state whose laws and institutions would serve the purpose of consumer capitalism. As such, the historical injustice that was partition would be realigned to suit the needs of this London-inspired elite to reconcile the Republic's original sin of adherence to Catholicism. Quote, partition was no longer an injustice perpetuated by Britain against Ireland, but a problem largely of our own making, which would be solved by the removal of religious influences from the laws of the Republic and by reconciliation in the North. And so, by hook or by crook, this new elite sought to unite Ireland by making Ireland less Irish. By discarding of our Catholic ideals and doing away with what distinguished Ireland from Britain, only then could we unite this country. The blueprint was spelled out in Fennell's seminal book, Nice People and Rednecks, when he said, quote, if the Catholic clergy would only stop interfering, and if we got religion out of our schools and laws and public life, we would come into our own as human beings. We would have a rational, peaceful, liberated life. All this in spite of the fact, as Fennell elucidates in Ireland After the End of Western Civilization, Ireland was one of the least Catholic countries in Europe, if not the world. Take the example of Italy, where, quote, regular practice of Catholicism is considerably less. There is much more public recognition of many people's belief in the existence of a spiritual world and of the pursuit of holiness, of elements of life, past and present. Referencing the strong persistence in Italy of a Catholic culture in the form of town and city festivals in which the civic authorities actively participate, because of Ireland's ruinous history, it has deprived us of such a normal heritage of a Catholic people, in which St. Patrick's Day apart, our special public holidays are days when the banks are closed. This, Fennell said, epitomized the parody of a capitalist society. Now, observing the recent St. Patrick's Day festival, it is noticeable how subservient the spiritual and religious components are to the materialist and commercialist elements. While giving his annual St. Patrick's Day address, President Michael D. Higgins negated any mention of the Christian elements to the holiday, instead emphasizing the disregard humanity has shown to our new gods in the form of Mother Nature, when he said the day represents, quote, the flagrant degradation of our natural world that impacts the consequences of climate change on those least responsible for it. The official government-sponsored St. Patrick's Day Festival cultural company describes the day as having evolved into a vibrant celebration encompassing the richness of Irish culture. Part of this evolution of Irish culture for them involves brandishing not St. Patrick with his distinctive walking stick and shamrock, but rather the symbol that defined pagan pre-Christian Ireland, the snake. The official symbol of modern St. Patrick's Day is, my friends, the snake. I remember walking down the streets of Dublin on this hitherto Christian celebration last year, only to find the streets engulfed with snakes, bereft of any Christian components. Given how Christianity is bad for business, it only makes sense that to lure international sponsors and tourists alike into Ireland, it makes sense to emphasise the secular and disregard the metaphysical. Thus, the spectacle of drag queens, lizards, and snakes lining the streets during the parade seeks to remind the public that St. Patrick's Day serves not our Christian heritage, but, in the words of Fennell, the forces of consumerist liberalism. The return to paganism is actually celebrated by certain sections of the commentariat. In an article for the Irish Examiner, Jennifer Horgan, seemingly speaking for 5 million people, mentioned that Irish people have had enough of the Roman Catholic Church. More and more of us have had enough of the misogyny, the dogmatism, and the vilification of the flesh, and are moving forward and simultaneously back to a pantheistic way of the world. Yet despite being a secular country, we still hear many of these same figures complain of rampant misogyny and dogmatism in our society, from the gender pay gap to Donald Trump or Elon Musk's latest statement or tweet. But while the D4 commentariat love to brandish their European credentials, Fennell actually travelled and lived in the pagan utopias that adopted these pre-Christian ideals. In these places, they do not feel the need to bore their publics with such messaging, but rather bask in the glory of having discarded Christianity. That is why Fennell said he, quote, liked pagan places like Stockholm and Paris, as no one there bores you with such twaddle, and no one believes it. In this current era of post-Christianity, or pre-Christianity, depending on your interpretation, rationalized as an age of irreligion, away from the imposed dogmas and pieties of the past. Instead, a new form of religion and doctrine has been foisted with the advent of political correctness. In Uncertain Dawn, Hiroshima, and the beginning of the post-Western civilization in 1996, Fennell listed all these new modern shibboleths which replaced the sins of the past, including anti-Semitism, racism, McCarthyism, censorship, sexism, fundamentalism, homophobia, sexual harassment, fatness, earth abuse, smoking, pollution, unsafe sex, species murder, and in certain sectors, lookism, ableism, heterosexism, flesh-eating, and ageism. Now, as mentioned, Fennell identified this new age as beginning at the end of the Second World War. Now, what better encapsulated the disregard for humanity and the utilitarian approach where the ends justify the means than in the plume of smoke that was the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? For Fennell, the Manhattan Project's naming the bomb the Trinity, deliberately named after the Christian God, represented a break not only with the Christian ethical tradition common to Europeans and Americans, but also with its Greco-Roman underlays, and therefore with the entire ethical system which has characterized the West since Emperor Constantine made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. This post-Christian order, or what Fennell saw as the pursuit of more justice, wealth, and empowerment for all, saw the replacement of many of these rules of European civilization with new rules. Now, it was Charles Darwin who believed that organisms with traits better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. But under the new rules of this post-Christian era, we see plummeting birth rates and more social anarchy than ever before. These new rules, as Fennell described them, were simply not conducive to the flourishing of human life, but rather formed a, quote, life framework which it does not make sense to bear children into. Now, in quite a controversial article for the Irish Times, Fennell warned that crumbling birth rates would render white Europeans a, quote, dying breed. Now, in keeping with his propensity for idiosyncrasy, Fennell was not some sort of, ethno-nationalist nativist, and believed that purity of race was not essential for nationhood. However, he called for greater scrutinization of the, quote, prevailing politically correct rules that bear on women's lives, and particularly on motherhood, in which the collection of rules which forms the basis of our successful consumerist system would help to institute an authoritative critical examination of their prevailing rule system. But what are these systems? As some attribute these politically correct rules which bear on women's lives and motherhoods to the political decision to all but do away with the single income household, which formed the basis of the nuclear families of the past. This began in earnest in the year 2000 or 2001 in order to increase labour force participation by eliminating the full joint assessment of income tax. This meant now less taxes were paid for couples where both worked outside the home. This change saw an increase in the number of women working outside the home, and over time saw an increase in house prices, making it much more difficult for a single breadwinner to raise a family at home. The end result of this incremental doing away with the inherent role played by women in a family presented itself last year when the Irish government sought to remove the role played by women and mothers in the Constitution by removing the protections afforded to mothers who may feel obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour to the neglect of their duties in the home, and recognise the common good that a woman gives to the state by her life in the home. Resoundingly defeated by an electorate who defied previous liberal trends, the one holdout remains the Betty Noir of Fennell, that being the D4 class in Dun Laoghaire, who voted to remove those amendments. In 1993, in RTE Studios, Fennell described the D4 class as either opposed or indifferent to the Irish dream, concerned only with individualist priorities. Sitting next to him was Michael McDowell, who described such sentiments as intellectual waffle with no substance. Rather paradoxically, McDowell played a key part in defeating those proposed amendments, often adopting some of Fennell's rhetorical flourishes in his opposition to the changes on the airways and newspaper columns. But while the defeat of the individualistic D4 class offered a momentary sigh of relief to the opponents of such an order, ultimately the secularist post-national and provincial Ireland Fennell warned of still surrounds us almost entirely. Yet as we lament the loss of Irish distinctiveness, let us not forget the man who provided a blueprint for challenging the orthodoxies of his day in the here and now. Across Europe, we are seeing moves towards reclaiming what made each country unique and distinctive, with groups and movements reimagining a new outlook beyond the end of history last man liberalism. Our challenge today is to reimagine Fennellism in the 21st century. We must not seek to return to some imagined utopia in which everything was perfect. The past is the past. We can look only to the future. Our current leaders offer nothing but hedge funds, vulture funds, pods, detached centralisation, tax rises, high crime, careless immigration, consumerist liberalism, mandatory two-income households, a generation locked out of the housing market, social atomisation and revisionism. The very things Fennell spent his career opposing and offering alternatives to. Ireland is a unique country. It is a country whose memory lives on despite attempts to do away with it as such. The remnants of the Irish nation remain in the churches, the Irish language signs, and the bullet holes at the GPO. And when we fully reconceptualise what Ireland means, we will finally achieve what Desmond Fennell set out as his dream, being an Ireland democratically self-governing in all its parts, economically self-sustaining, intellectually self-determining, and culturally self-shaping. Thank you.